Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with loaded butternut squash cordon bleu. That's right, there are so many amazing things people do with butternut squash. They roast it, they make soup, well, actually, that's pretty much it. Which is why I'm so excited to show you this. And by the way, I'm burying the lead here. This video is actually serving as a test for a new studio I'm going to be filming in. So if everything looks different, it is. And I was not working with my full setup. But despite that, this came out incredibly well. And to get started, let's talk about how to choose the right butternut squash for this recipe. And that would be one where the bottom and the top part or neck are about the same size. Okay, the bottom's always going to be a little more bulbous, but if you can, try to find one like this where that is not so pronounced. And then once we have our squash, the next thing we want to do is cut it in half lengthwise without losing a finger. And for that, we will start our cut going through the top, ideally cutting through that really hard stem right through the center. And at no point during this operation should your other hand come anywhere near that blade. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll use that as a guide to cut all the way to the back of the squash. Although definitely not in one big grand cut. Okay, we want to go slow and just do a little bit at a time, which I do with a combination of a rocking motion on the knife, as well as for the thicker parts giving it a little pound with the other hand on top. But again, at no point is our guide hand anywhere close to being able to go under the blade. And eventually, especially if your first cut was nicely centered, you should be able to split this in two very uniformly. And that's it, we now have two halves, and at least 10 fingers. And then once we have that split, we'll go ahead and take a spoon and scrape out the seeds. And one of the main reasons I want you to buy a squash that's not overly curvaceous is because you're going to have less seeds and more squash. Okay, so please remember that old rhyme. If the butternut squash has a large ass, you're going to want to take a pass. But anyway, we'll go ahead and scrape out those seeds as shown. And then so these sit nice and flat, I think we should slice off about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom. Right, not too much. Just a little bit so they lay nice and flat. And that is going to be it for our prep. We'll go ahead and transfer those onto a foil-lined baking sheet. At which point we can transfer that into the center of a 375-degree oven for about an hour and a half or so, depending on the size, or until they are beautifully tender but not falling apart. And of course, we're going to test that with the tip of a knife. And you can see here some old scars from previous testing. And then as soon as those are cool enough to handle, what we'll do is scoop that cooked squash into a bowl. But very important, we do want to leave about a 1/2 inch attached to the skin. So I'll actually use the boundary of the cavity at the bottom as a guide, and then we'll go around scooping, getting most of it. But like I said, we do want to leave some attached so this doesn't fall apart, since of course we're going to use these as shells to stuff everything back into. And if we end up scooping all the way down to the skin, these might sort of collapse when we cook them, and they just won't look as nice. And then to our scoop squash, we will add some salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, plus a nice big spoon of Dijon mustard, which is absolutely critical here. Okay, we really do need that to balance the sweetness and the richness. And that's it, we're going to finish this step up with 1 beaten egg, at which point we'll take a nice big spoon and give this a mix, but also a mash, alright, if you want. Okay, if you want to leave this nice and chunky, that's your business. I mean, you guys are after all the lords of your loaded gourds. But personally, I do like to smash mine fairly smooth. And then what we'll do once that's been all stirred and smashed together is toss in some sliced green onions. Followed by, because we're calling this cordon bleu, some diced smoked ham, and a lot of it, as well as some Gruyere cheese, which is the classic cheese used in cordon bleu. But I think a nice sharp white cheddar would also work out beautifully here. And that's it, we'll simply give this a mix until everything is combined. And as you might have noticed, I actually diced the cheese instead of grating it, since I think texturally those bigger pieces are going to work better in this. Okay, I think if the cheese is grated, it sometimes emulsifies right into the squash, instead of having hundreds of little pockets of cheese here and there. And also, I forgot to bring the cheese grater to the chute. And that's it, as soon as that's mixed, we'll go ahead and fill our shells as evenly as possible, which is a classic example of a super obvious instruction that nobody ever needs, but always gets. Okay, raise your hand if you were going to put a lot more in one than the other. See, I didn't need to tell you that. But what I do need to tell you is that once those halves are stuffed, we'll go ahead and top this with a little more cheese. And I'm actually going to use a potato peeler here to make nice long thin slices, which I think is going to look a little nicer than if we used a grater, which of course coincidentally I don't have. And just to bother some people, I did one haphazardly, and then did the second one in a much more orderly fashion. Probably to prove that once they come out of the oven, they're going to look the same. And that's it, once those have been cheesed, rando and crosshatch were ready to transfer into the center. of a 475-degree oven for about 15 minutes or so, or until they're beautifully browned and look like there's a green onion on the table. Man, that's annoying. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, or until they look like this. And I know it is not normal to get so excited over a squash recipe, but I really was, since this looked and smelled so amazing. And then I went ahead and transferred those onto a cutting board for service, partly because I didn't have a big platter with me, but also because we're going to slice these into sections when we serve them anyway. And that's it. I went ahead and finished up with some sliced green onions. And then I relocated to our new quartz countertop, since I thought it would look nicer for the pictures. Since, as I mentioned, this was a test for getting a feel for the new studio. And we'll do a full reveal at the appropriate time, but here's a little sneak peek at the range island. Okay, that's enough. But anyway, I grabbed a knife and sliced in, and loved everything I was feeling and seeing. And I couldn't wait to grab a fork and dig in. And that, my friends, was some incredibly hammy, cheesy, butternut squashy goodness. Okay, extremely flavorful as well as fairly rich and decadent, but not overly so. And a lot of that comes from the Gruyere cheese, which is very buttery and nutty, and that's why it works so well with the squash. And of course, smoked ham is never not great with these ingredients, so I don't really feel like I even need to mention that. And I'm not doing a very good job of showing it, but the still attached squash does come off really easily from the skin. Okay, I was just worried about hitting the tripod. It's not really that hard. So yes, this was quite lovely eating right off the cutting board. But I did go ahead and plate up another portion next to a salad, which I think for something like this is a very necessary pairing. Right, not only do we get a temperature and texture contrast, but an acidic dressing will help cut through the richness we spoke about earlier. And I know, you're probably thinking that all sounds great, but please, for the love of God, can you eat that piece of diced ham off the top? It's been sitting up there way too long. Don't worry, I got you. And while I'm definitely presenting this as a main course, I think this could also work very nicely as a holiday side dish. Although I would probably switch out the ham for some caramelized mushrooms, which I'm thinking would be very, very nice. But whether you make this meatless or not, or you serve it as an entree or a side, either way, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Roasted butternut squash soup. That's right, even if you don't have a calendar, you can tell when it's turning fall. The leaves change colors, there's a little chill in the air, and Twitter fills up with pictures and links to butternut squash soup recipes. And it was seeing a couple of those that reminded me I've never posted my version for this quintessential autumn soup. So let's go ahead and get started with prepping what I call the world's most dangerous gourd. And that's because the butternut squash is so big and so hard, it's basically a severe cut waiting to happen. So I'm going to show you what I think is the safest way to split this, which is by cutting off the top here. And then what we'll do is we'll take a large sharp knife and cut directly into the center of the neck, just like this. And please note my other hand is not getting anywhere close to this blade. And is it going to matter that I didn't cut that exactly in half, because I was paying more attention to the camera than I was to the squash? No, it won't be a problem at all. And then once we split that through the center like that, what we'll do is we'll tip it up like this and simply cut it straight down to split. And for me, not only is that the easiest way, it's definitely the safest, because at no time should any of your fingers be in the way. So we'll split our squash in half, and then we'll grab a spoon and scrape out the seeds. And of course, yes, we could save those seeds and roast them, but we're probably not going to do that. Hey, we're busy making soup, but if you want to, go for it. You are the lords of your gourds, so feel free. And then once our butternut squash has been split and scooped, we can move on to prepping our roasting pan, where we're not only going to roast our squash, but we will also roast the other vegetables going in the soup. So let's go ahead and drizzle a little olive oil into the bottom of the pan, and then we'll dump in our onions and carrots, and we'll give that a nice big pinch of salt, and give that a little toss in the oil. And I'm also going to toss in about 6 whole peeled garlic cloves. All right, don't slice them, don't smash them too much. Just toss those in whole. And then we'll place our butternut squash in, cut side up. And I'm also going to give that a little sprinkling of salt. And then we're going to roast all of that in a 400-degree oven for about an hour, or until our squash is soft enough to scoop. So mine took about an hour, but that's really going to depend on the size of your butternuts. And how you're going to tell is how we usually tell. We'll give it the old poka with a knife. And as you can see, those have been previously poked. And then what we'll do is we'll let that stuff cool down a little bit. And while we're waiting, we're going to go ahead and make what is basically the secret ingredient to this recipe, a sage-infused brown butter. So what we'll do is we'll melt about 4 tablespoons of butter over medium heat. And you've probably seen this before. First it melts, then it foams up, and then it starts to slowly but surely take on a little bit of a golden color. And at this point, it's not a bad idea to turn your heat down just a hair so we don't go too far. Because what we're trying to do is catch it at that perfect moment when it goes from golden to sort of a light nutty brown, which is what we have right here. And at that point, we're going to quickly do 2 things. We're going to turn off the heat and throw in a handful of sage leaves. And even though the heat's off, there's going to be enough heat in that butter to toast those leaves and infuse that butter with its gorgeous, gorgeous flavor. So we'll stir in our sage leaves, and we'll simply leave that on the back of the stove until it's ready to add to the soup, which is going to be pretty soon, because once your veggies are roasted, this is a very fast soup to put together. So we'll go back over to our squash, which have cooled down a little by now, and what we'll do is we'll scoop out that flesh. And yes, we did get a lot of beautiful caramelization on those onions and carrots, which is not only going to add flavor, but it's also going to help give us a beautiful color. Not only do we want this soup to taste roasted, we want it to look roasted. And then, like I said, we'll scoop out our squash into that pan. And please don't worry if you get a little piece of skin here or there. We're definitely going to strain this soup, so no big deal. So we'll go ahead and we'll scoop out our nice soft squash, at which point we are now officially ready to make the soup. So we'll head over to the stove and transfer everything into a soup kettle. And once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add our brown sage butter. And then for a little touch of extra sweetness, we'll do about a tablespoon or 2 of either honey or maple syrup. And both will work beautifully here. But personally, I go with the maple syrup. And the reason is simple. I like Canadians better than I like bees. And then we'll go ahead and add our chicken broth. And yes, of course, you can go with water or vegetable stock if you're one of them that are vegetarians. There's nothing wrong with that. Hey, if everybody ate meat, it would be more expensive. So to me, selfishly, they do serve a valuable purpose. And we'll give that a stir. And we'll turn our heat up to high and bring this up to a simmer. And then what we'll do as soon as our soup starts bubbling is we'll turn our heat down to low and simmer this for about 45 minutes to an hour. And even though everything's cooked, and there really is no great scientific reason to cook it that long, I do it anyway, and I think it comes out better. So I would love to explain why, but I can't. And after about 1 hour, this is what mine look like. And at this point, we're ready for final production. So the first step to that is we're going to blend this very, very smoothly. And of course, you can do that in batches in a blender, but I find these stick or immersion blenders much, much faster and easier. So I'm going to blend mine for a few minutes until it's very smooth, at which point I'm going to highly suggest we pass this through a strainer. Okay, the blades of a blender or food processor are really never going to break down all that material as small as those incredibly tiny holes in our strainer. So by passing that through, even though it's going to look pretty much the same, you're going to get something that on the palate feels much smoother, much silkier. So we'll go ahead and strain our soup, and we should be left with only the most fibrous bits. And then once our soup is strained, we're on to the adjustment phase. First up, adjusting the thickness. So I'm going to check this out with my ladle, and it is very, very close, but I do want it just a hair thinner. I mean, we do want it thick and hearty, but we don't want pie filling. So if you need to, add a little bit of water. That's just you cooking. And then the second adjustment will be to balance the sweetness with the following ingredients. We're going to put a nice big splash of apple cider vinegar, as well as a couple nice big pinches of salt. And of course, we'll bless this with a little shake of cayenne. And as soon as we stir that in, and the soup heats through, we're done. Of course, we're going to take a spoon and taste it, because you may still need to adjust with a little more salt. So I gave mine a taste, and it was perfect. So I went ahead and ladled that up into a hot bowl. And I'm going to garnish it very simply with a nice spoon of creme fraiche, which you know you can make yourself, right? We have a video for that. And I'm going to finish off with some chopped chives. And that, my friends, may be the best autumn soup of all time. Just an absolutely gorgeous color, and what I'm pretty sure you'll think is an incredibly deep, rich, satisfying flavor. I mean, butternut squash already have a beautiful, earthy, subtle sweetness that we've just accentuated a little bit with that maple syrup. And the way those sweet flavors kind of play against that little bit of vinegar and that little bit of tanginess from the creme fraiche is just absolutely delicious. But anyway, that's it. Roasted butternut squash soup. I was just about to say wait for the next cold, rainy day and whip up a pot. But you know what? This stuff is so good. No matter what your current atmospheric conditions are, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Butternut squash cakes. This video is a team effort between me and my friend Stephanie Stivetti, seen here checking her look in a meat cleaver. So Stephanie is a friend of mine and a gluten-free blogger, and she invited me to check out her famous gluten-free butternut squash cakes recipe. So I jumped at the chance, and really I would have been crazy not to. All right, so this recipe starts by peeling a butternut squash. Be very careful. There are few things slipperier than a peeled butternut squash. So we're going to cut this in big chunks because the first step here is we're going to grate this using our grater attachment on a food processor. And by the way, if you're poor and don't have one of these, you can grate it by hand. It'll work. And we're going to need about 2 cups for this recipe. Now, because butternut squash vary in size, just grate whatever you have, and any extra you can freeze and just thaw out when you need it. In fact, that's what you see here. There's some frozen butternut squash Stephanie is draining on some paper towels to use for a big batch of these. Other than the butternut squash, we also need about a 1/4 cup or so of diced onions, and we're going to soften those in a little bit of vegetable oil with a pinch of salt, and we're just going to cook those until soft and sweet. Once those are done, you can set those aside. All right, on to the cakes. We're going to take a couple cups of our freshly grated butternut squash with some salt, some black pepper, some cumin, or cumin if you prefer, some curry powder, and that's pretty much it. All right, you don't need a lot here because we want to taste the natural goodness of the butternut squash. All right, we're going to give that a quick mix. I'm also going to beat 1 large egg. Okay, mix that in. Now at this point, if I wasn't worrying about gluten, I would just add some flour. But we're not going to do that because this is gluten-free. So we're going to use these 2 fine products. This is gluten-free corn flour and also a garbanzo bean and fava bean flour. So you're going to find these at pretty much any health food store, any specialty grocery. Bob's Red Mill, very well known for these specialty flours. So those are not too hard to find. All right, so we're going to add those 2 non-wheat flours to our mixture. All right, we're going to give that a quick mix. And by the way, we really should have added our now cooled soft sweet onions. So we're going to mix those in. And then that is really it. Now it probably would have been okay mixing with just a fork, but you know, when your name is Stephanie Stivetti, you got to get all Italian on this thing and use your hands. All right, so either way, once it's mixed, you're ready to fry. All right, we're going to put our heat on medium, and this is pretty much like any potato pancake or vegetable cake would be. A little bit of vegetable oil in a skillet. Like I said, medium heat. You're going to flatten that out to about 1/4 inch and fry them for about 3 minutes per side. Although, you know what? This is not an exact science. You want it crispy and browned on the outside, tender and delicious in the middle. This is very versatile. You can do, large ones if you want to do like first courses. You could do small little silver dollar size to use as like a base for an appetizer. So you can go a lot of different ways with this. Now, Stephanie tells me these are traditionally served with plain yogurt, which would be delicious. Or as we did here, some just regular sour cream, little color. We did some chopped pumpkin seeds. Then I tasted this and I was like, man, that is really good. But you know what? I needed a second opinion. So we gave Stephanie some. And she made faces like that, which of course you can't fake, so you know it's good. So anyway, there you go. Easy, nutritious, and delicious butternut squash cakes. Thank you, Stephanie. By the way, you're going to read more about her on the blog post. She's also posting a version of this recipe on her site with her own unique voiceover, so you'll want to check that out. So anyway, we hope you give that a try. Very seasonally appropriate. All the ingredients are on the site as usual. And as always, enjoy. Butternut squash and mascarpone cheese gnocchi. Or is it mascarpone? I don't know. It was Al Capone, not El Capone. Anyway, however you pronounce it, this was so unbelievably delicious. And here's how I did it. It was pretty easy. I took a butternut squash. I'm only going to use about half of it. I want a pound in this recipe. So I trimmed off the top, cut it in half, split that down the middle. Once that was split, I put it on a plate, covered it in plastic wrap, and microwaved it on high until tender. Now I know we don't do a lot of microwaving around here, but it works great for this. You could roast it if you want, but this is just a lot faster and easier. So that's how I did it. You can do it any way you want. So that took me about 8 minutes. I unwrapped it, I let it cool on paper towels, and when it's cool enough to handle, peel off the skin. It should peel right off. If not, use a knife. So there we go. I got about 2 cups altogether, and I'm going to set that aside until needed. All right, for the rest of the mixture, so easy. Some mascarpone cheese, very, very rich. Italian cream cheese. We're also going to add a couple large eggs, some salt, some black pepper, and some Parmesan cheese. Okay, finely grated Parmesan. And once that's grated in there, I'm going to give this a mix. And right here I realized, why am I trying to mix this with a spatula? So I switched to a whisk, which is going to do a faster and better job. And you want to whisk that together until it's all smooth. And it looks like that. All right. And then we're going to throw in, which by now is just barely warm, butternut squash. I'm going to whisk that in. I'm going to mash it. I'm not going to puree this in a blender, which some recipes will have you do. I actually want those little tiny particles of squash intact. I think it's a little harder to work with, but I think it's much better for the final product. All right, and then the final ingredient here, which I'm going to stir in a couple additions, is just regular all-purpose flour. Not much. I'm only going to put in about a cup. Unlike most traditional gnocchi recipes, this is not a dense, chewy, kind of firm gnocchi. This is a very soft, light, tender dumpling. So we don't want to do too much mixing here. As soon as the flour disappears, that's it. It'll look like that, which is too soft to work with. So we're going to wrap it in plastic, and we're going to refrigerate this hopefully overnight. At least 4 or 5 hours, but overnight's better, and you'll notice the next day it's pretty much firmed up and will let us form our dumplings. But before we unwrap this and start that process, we need to do two things. We're going to bring some salted water to a boil. Now I'm using a shallow saucepan here so you can see what I'm doing. You can use a stock pot if you want, of course. And we're also going to melt some butter in a non-stick pan next to that water. So just use medium heat. As soon as the butter melts, turn off the flame until needed. All right, and now the fun part. To shape our gnocchi, we're going to use 2 tablespoons. The first one I'm going to stick in there. I'm going to grab about, maybe a teaspoon and a half of mixture. And I'm going to use the second spoon to push it off into the boiling water. So very simple process. First spoon scoops a little. Second spoon pushes it off into the boiling salted water. Now here's some good news. No matter how bad a job you think you're doing at this, it's going to look awesome when it's cooked. Gnocchi hate anxiety. Okay, they don't respond well, so I need you to relax and actually have some fun while you're doing this. All right, so our heat's on high. We're going to do these in batches. I usually do about 12 to 15 at a time. I'm doing a few less here just for the camera. In like a minute or two, they're going to float to the top. And once they float to the top, I let them boil another minute. So this whole thing only takes a couple minutes per batch. And after they floated to the top and cooked for another minute, I fish them out with one of these strainers right into my butter. And you can just let them sit there until you're ready for final service. And be sure to read the blog post where I explain what to do if you don't want to cook these right away. But I do. So I'm going to go ahead and crank my heat up to medium-high. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to brown these in the butter, maybe 3-4 minutes per side. You have to be the judge. But basically, we want a nice golden brown crust and a light creamy center. All right, while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and season these with some black pepper, some cayenne, and another pinch of salt. All right, and after 3 or 4 minutes, I decided mine were perfect to turn. All right, so you can use tongs for this. I'm using 2 freakishly small wooden spoons. By the way, yes, I believe this is the first time we've had hot, freakishly small wooden spoon on freakishly small wooden spoon action. So that's kind of cool. All right, so I flip those over carefully. And we're going to give them a few minutes on the other side. And while that's happening, the last ingredient, I'm going to throw in some thinly sliced sage leaves, which just works so amazingly perfect with this dish. So the sage went in. I gave it another 2 minutes or so. And at this point, my senses of sight, sound, and smell told me, hey, these are done. Let's eat. I removed those to a warm plate. I'm just doing little appetizer-sized portions. I'm going to spoon a little bit of that browned butter over. All right, you don't need much. Like a teaspoon's fine. What is that, maybe 30 or 40 calories? Everyone relax. I'm going to hit it with some Parmesan cheese. And there you go. Just unbelievably delicious. That outside is golden brown, slightly crisp from that Parmesan kind of crusting up. The inside, impossibly light, tender, and delicious. So I hope you give those a try. This would make a fantastic first course for any winter, fall dinner, especially around the holidays. So anyway, head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more information as usual. And as always, enjoy. Butternut Bisque. Let's go ahead and get started. And we'll begin this like almost all great soups begin, with a nice big chunk of butter that we're going to melt over medium-low heat. And then to that we're going to add 1 diced onion, along with a nice big pinch of salt. And what we'll do is let this cook stirring occasionally until those onions really soften up and turn translucent and almost start to melt into the butter. And we're going to take our time, which is why we have this on medium-low. Okay, we don't necessarily want to get color on these onions. We just want them to slowly sweeten and soften, which is probably going to take a good 10 or 15 minutes. And what we'll do while we're waiting is prep our butternut squash. And there it is, your standard soup size, approximately 2-pound butternut squash. And what we'll do to prep this is cut off both ends, although feel free to not take so much off. And then what we'll do is cut halfway in, right in the center, cutting down and all the way through. And then we'll turn the squash and put the knife back into the incision and finish the cut through the other end, thereby splitting the squash pretty much in half, or at least close enough for YouTube. And then once split, let's go ahead and take a spoon and remove the seeds. And if you want, once all those seeds are scraped out, you can actually separate those from all that sticky, slimy, fibrous stuff, and then roast them and eat them. Or you can do what I do, which is scrape them up and throw them right in the garbage. And then what we'll do once our squash has been split and seeded is take a peeler and remove all the skin. And by the way, the reason we want to do this after we've cut our squash in half is because a peeled butternut squash is extremely, extremely slippery and significantly more dangerous to cut. So I find this post-split peeling method much safer. And then what we'll do once this is peeled is simply cut it up into chunks, about the size you see here. And then once this is cut up, we have a big decision to make. Are we going to roast this squash in the oven before adding it to our onions? Or are we going to add it as is? And for me, I base the decision on how I'm going to use the soup. Okay, if I'm going to serve it for a main course, then I usually roast the squash, because that's going to produce a sweeter, richer product. But here, since I'm going to serve this as a first course before a relatively heavy meal, I'm not going to roast it and add it as is, which is going to produce something lighter and brighter, a lover, not a fighter. Because while I still want something very tasty, I don't want anything too sweet and filling. And I'll discuss this issue further on the blog, but for this version we're going to use it raw. And once that's set, we'll go back and check our onions, which by now should be nice and soft, and look a little something like this. And then what we'll do at this point is raise our heat to medium-high, and add our secret ingredient, a spoon of tomato paste. And we'll go ahead and stir that in, and we're going to cook that for about 2 minutes or so, just until it starts to caramelize and turn brown. And not only is this going to add to the savoriness of the soup, but the acidity from that tomato is really going to work nicely with the squash. Okay, so like I said, we'll cook that for a couple minutes until it starts to brown up and looks like this. At which point we can go ahead and toss in our squash, along with 1 quart of chicken broth. Or if you're one of those vegetarians I've heard of, you could certainly go with water or vegetable stock, whatever that is. And we'll give that a stir. And then what we'll do while we're waiting for this to come up to a simmer is add some more salt, as well as a shake of cayenne. And as soon as that comes up to a simmer on medium-high, we'll reduce it to medium-low, and simply simmer this for about a half hour or so, or until those chunks of squash are very, very, very tender. Not sort of tender, really tender. And of course, the way you're going to tell is by testing them with a fork. And you'll know. You'll be like, wow, these are tender. If you're not sure, let it keep simmering. But once we are sure, we'll reduce our heat to low, and then proceed to blend this until completely smooth. And for that, these stick blenders are very convenient. Although feel free to use your traditional blender. I would just do it in a couple batches so you don't burn yourself. And we'll want to take our time here and make sure this is absolutely smooth. Since I'm not going to strain this, although you could. But anyway, we're going to work that over with our blender until 100% chunk free. At which point we can add our heavy cream if we're using, which we are. And by the way, creme fraiche would also work here, and maybe even better. And then as soon as that cream heats through and the soup's back up to temperature, we'll go ahead and give it a taste and possibly adjust with a couple things. We're probably almost always going to need some more salt. So I'm going to go ahead and stir a little more of that in. And then if you want, and I almost always do, I like to add about a tablespoon or 2 of maple syrup. All right, to up that sweetness level just a hair, but not too much, just a touch, Because as I discussed, and the same reason I'm not roasting the squash, I don't want this to be too sweet and filling. So we're just going to stir in a little bit to balance the flavors. And believe it or not, that's it. We'll give that one last taste. And assuming it's nice and hot, and seasoned exactly how we want, this incredibly easy soup is done and ready to serve up. And as hopefully you can see, this is not too thick. Okay, for a first course, that's exactly the texture I want. And if you think yours is too thick, just stir in a little more broth. That's just you cooking. But this was the exact viscosity I wanted, so I went ahead and served it up. And if there's a more beautiful orange color in the universe, I would really look forward to seeing that. Because to me, this is just stunning. I mean, there's no way to look at that color and not be happy. Go ahead, try it. And then because this is going to be a first course at that special occasion dinner, I'm going to swirl in a little bit of fresh cream. And then top that with some freshly snipped chives, as well as a few jewels of pomegranate. And that's it. What we're calling Butternut Bisque is done. So let me go ahead and grab a spoon and dig in and see how we did. And even though we didn't roast and caramelize the squash, it still has that beautiful, earthy, starchy, slightly sweet flavor we know and love, accentuated by that little bit of maple syrup we added. But by not roasting, we have something that's a little more vegetal, right? A little lighter, a little less filling, which is going to please but not satisfy the palate. Because as I mentioned, if we're doing this as a first course, we have many more courses to come. But if you do want something more substantial, by all means roast the squash, and then you could garnish with things like crispy bacon, or diced ham, or even some sliced sausage, or whatever. As usual, those pairings would be up to you. You are, after all, the Carlton Fisk of your Butternut Bisque. Is it bad I'm already thinking about spring training? But anyway, for this non-roasted lighter version, this garnish worked beautifully, even though I was having trouble here getting some pomegranate on the spoon. All right, there we go. Which, in addition to looking great, really works great texturally and flavor-wise, since those little bursts of sweet tart flavor kind of resets the palate. But anyway, that's it. My take on Butternut Bisque. Whether you are going to serve this as a fancy first course for your holiday feast, or just on some cold, dreary weeknight, when you're in serious need of some liquid love, either way, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Red curry butternut squash. That's right, a side dish not on the safe side. Now here's a little tip. When you buy butternut squash, look for ones that aren't curvy. All right, because the bigger the bottom, the more seeds. So if you get one that's kind of straight like that, you're going to get more flesh. Okay, not a huge difference, but you know what? They're easier to peel anyway. Now, speaking of peeling, you can use a vegetable peeler if you want. I like to use the knife. Old prep cook habits die hard. If you use a knife, be really careful. Butternut squash are infamously slippery. Butternut squash are responsible for more squash-related injuries than any other squash. Okay, so be careful. All right, once that's peeled, we're going to cut those in kind of inch-thick slices. I'm going to make, squares. You know my system. Pick a size, stick with it. All right, so I'm going to cut these all the same size or as close as humanly possible. When you get down to the end that has the seeds, just scrape those out. All right, cut those in as close as you can to the other size. So I cubed up 2 butternut squash and on to the rest of the ingredients. All right, so I washed 1 bunch of green onions. I'm going to save about a tablespoon or so of the green end, chop that up and reserve that. That's for garnish. And the rest I'm going to slice up. All right, now in a Dutch oven, something with a lid and something kind of wide. I'm going to throw in a little bit of vegetable oil, my green onions, cumin, and then I'm going to take one for the team here. I can get all kinds of exotic spices in San Francisco, but I'm going to do this on what you can find in the supermarket. That is standard McCormick brand red curry powder. Okay, tablespoon of that. I also have, right from the supermarket, from the Asian section, there'll be 1 brand of Thai ingredients. They will sell a red curry paste, so I'm going to use some of that. Okay, we're also going to use some tomato paste. That's going to give it some nice acidity and color. Then I'm going to turn the heat on, which hasn't been on so far. And over medium heat, I'm going to toast those ingredients for about 5 minutes. It's going to kind of wake up the spices. It's going to caramelize the tomato a little bit. It's going to soften the onion a little bit. It does good things. All right, after 5 minutes, I'm going to throw in my crushed garlic. Give that another minute, and then we're ready for the star of the show, other than the butternut squash. 1 can of full fat, regular, not light, 1 can of coconut milk. Coconut milk is such a great ingredient. Stop saying you can't find the stuff. You can too. Go to the big supermarket, the one with the parking lot. Okay? They have an Asian section. You'll find these ingredients. So I'm going to put in some brown sugar, a little sweetness to balance the acidity and the heat, and then some fish sauce, which again, you got to go to the real supermarket to find. Or get it online. And that's going to kind of give us our salty aspect here. All right, we're going to mix that up. We're going to bring that to a simmer, give it a stir, and then we're going to add in our cubed butternut squash. You're going to turn the heat down to medium-low, give that a toss around, pat it down. We're going to put the lid on, and you're going to set your timer for 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, you're going to take off the cover and give it a good stir. Because the squash is not totally submerged in the cooking liquid, you got to keep stirring it so they cook evenly. Okay, and I don't want to add more liquid just to have them all boiling in the sauce. All right, I want it to be a nice, thick vegetable side dish, not a soup. So every 5 minutes, do that. Take it off, stir it, put it back on, 5 minutes, and so forth. After about 20 to 25 minutes, it's going to be perfectly tender. Be careful. They go from perfectly tender to butternut squash puree in about 5 minutes. So be careful towards the end. After 15 minutes, after 20 minutes, you're getting really close. Make sure you don't go over. I'm going to test this with a little paring knife. Perfect. When you determine it's tender, the last ingredient, some freshly torn basil leaves. Not chopped, not chiffonaded, torn. When you tear basil leaves, they don't turn black. You're going to give this that nice, fragrant, herbaceous basil leaf flavor that's really nice with red curry. I know you think basil Italian, but basil is really common in red curries. And then that's it. You know the rest. Throw it in a dish, put the rest of your green onions on top, and eat with a fork and or spoon. Make sure you taste before you serve, adjust the salt, and if you need to, the heat. Okay? Remember, you can't take out heat, you can add heat. If you're scared, go with half the amounts I did and adjust towards the end, and you'll be happy. This is a really interesting side dish. Butternut squash, not the most exciting vegetable, but in this treatment, I think it really kind of comes to life. All the ingredients are on the site, and as always, enjoy. Butternut Squash Mascarpone Ravioli. So I'm going to call these ravioli, but I'm not sure. There must be an Italian word for like a half a ravioli where you fold it over like that. Let's get started. I roasted 1 small butternut squash. I just cut it in quarters, scooped out the seeds, wrapped it in foil, baked it for about an hour at 375. Once it cooled, I scooped a cup into a mixing bowl. I'm going to season with some salt, some pepper, some cayenne pepper, of course. Then I'm going to put in a half a cup of mascarpone, that's the Italian cream cheese, 1 egg yolk, and some fresh grated Parmesan. Now, how simple is that filling? So basically these ravioli, or half ravioli, or demi ravioli, what's half in Italian? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to mix that up. So this is just going to be like a really nice, rich, kind of butternut squash puree. Here's my azumaya, which is Japanese for ravioli. These round wonton wrappers are incredibly fun and easy to work with. They are the perfect texture. They're kind of soft, and they have just a little tiny layer of starch on them, which if you take a wet towel, so you have it in this little ramekin, you can put a little water in there, and you can use your finger to go around the outside, around the outside, around the outside, and then you're going to put a teaspoon. I use the spoon-to-spoon method. I call it the 2-spoon method. And I'm going to put in about a teaspoon of filling, and then I'm going to fold it over. I'm going to squeeze the edges. That filling is going to make a lot, all right, a cup and a half. There's 48 teaspoons in a cup. So that's going to make you over 60, 70 of these little dumplings. And you can just mix up the filling, fill a few at a time when you want them. So that filling will keep a few days. And there you go. I did 12 there in like 5 minutes. So this is actually really fast to do. All right, so you're going to put on like a saucepan of water to boil, salted. And then right next to it, you want to put, I don't know, it depends on how many of these you cook at a time. But I just got a couple tablespoons of butter there. I'm going to cook 12 of these. So I'm going to brown the butter just on low heat. All right, I'm going to slowly brown it with just a little bit of garlic. I didn't even peel the garlic. I just want it scenting. Just the essence of garlic, a hint of garlic, a whisper of garlic. I don't want it too strong. By the way, back by popular demand, it's the little tiny wooden spoon. Oh yeah, everybody loves the little spoon. And then I'm going to boil my ravioli in the salted water only for like 2 minutes. As soon as they float, they're basically done. So you're going to take your strainer, you're going to transfer it into your brown butter. All right, these wonton wrappers are so thin and tender that they really cook quick. All right, I've turned that up to kind of medium high, and these are cooked, so we're just putting them in this brown butter to give them a little bit of color around the edges, just infuse them with that brown butter flavor. So we're only going to cook these in the butter for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 minutes. I'm going to throw in some chopped sage, which is just very traditional with brown butter and butternut squash. I'm going to do an appetizer here. I'm going to serve 4. I'm going to hit it with a little fresh pepper. You'll notice I got the few pieces of that fried sage on there. Some fresh Parmesan. That is a magnificent holiday and or winter appetizer idea. Incredibly easy to make. If you like the sweetness of butternut squash, you are going to love these. And why I do them as appetizer, not main course, because of the mascarpone and the little bit of sweetness of the butternut. These are kind of rich, so I think as an appetizer, these are perfect. You give 3 or 4, everyone goes, ooh, I can't believe you made homemade ravioli. And little do they know, using our wonton skins, we totally cheated, and it was so incredibly easy. I hope you give that a try. Of course, you're going to find all these specific and exact ingredient amounts on the website. And as always, enjoy. Creamy ham and butternut squash spaghetti. Oh man, this was so delicious that I had to show you, even though I filmed it at night, and I never film at night because I really like the natural light. So please pardon any substandard lighting issues, but I think it's totally worthwhile checking this out. So here we go. I'm going to start with a pan on medium heat with some olive oil and a big handful of sliced smoked ham. Now I'm using what's called Black Forest ham. Pretty much anything's going to work here, including, yes, bacon. But I cooked my ham in that olive oil for about 3 or 4 minutes, just until the edges kind of started to caramelize a little. All right, at that point, I threw in some sliced garlic, a good amount. And you know the drill. We don't want to burn the garlic or get it too dark. So we're going to cook that in that hot oil just until the edges barely start to turn golden. And when it looks like that, we're going to pour in some chicken stock or chicken broth. Not too much. We're going to bring that up to a simmer. And I'm going to dump in my cubed butternut squash. So dump that in, give it a stir. And what we're going to do here, we're basically going to braise that butternut squash with the ham and that little bit of broth until it's just barely tender. All right, I'm going to give it a shot of salt. We'll adjust that later. I'm going to give it a nice big pinch of hot red chili flakes. You know, I like a little heat usually in everything. All right, I'm going to throw the lid on here. I'm going to leave it on medium heat. If I have to add a splash of stock or broth along the way, no problem. But basically, we're just going to cook that covered until that squash is just tender. So mine took approximately 15 minutes. It'll depend. But when you can smash one of those cubes of squash, it's ready. Now, you could have added this at any time, but here I decided to add a nice, generous dose of freshly ground black pepper. And then, what makes it creamy, mascarpone cheese. Now, very important here, this can't be boiling. I want you to turn this down to the lowest setting. Add your cheese and slowly stir it in. We need to be very gentle with this. We don't want to boil it. We don't want to break it. We don't want to do anything severe to it. Okay, so keep it moving. It will melt pretty quickly and look like that. Beautifully creamy and luxurious. All right, last but not least, a nice big pinch of freshly chopped Italian parsley. Stir that in. All right, you could also replace that parsley with sage. That would be very appropriate, I think. All right, now you can basically turn that off and cover it until your pasta is cooked, which hopefully you've already started. I'm going to boil 1 package of whole grain spaghetti. That's why it looks a little dark. When that's done, I want to drain it really well. Do not rinse. Put it back in the pot. Pour over your hot sauce. Mix it thoroughly. You know, give it a minute to kind of soak in a little bit. You know our system with pastas. We never pour the sauce over the pasta on the plate. Mix it first. A little Parmesan cheese, maybe a little more hot pepper, up to you. Now you can make this any time of year, but for whatever reason, it just seems even more delicious in the fall or winter when the weather's a little cold. Serve it up in a bowl, maybe a little more Parmesan, that never hurts. And that is one fabulous bowl of pasta. That smoky ham, that sweet, earthy squash, the creamy mascarpone cheese, just beautiful together. Maybe a squeeze of fresh lemon in here to brighten it up wouldn't have been a bad idea. I didn't do it, but, something you could try. Anyway, there you go. Creamy ham and butternut squash spaghetti. I hope you give that a try. All the ingredients are on foodwishes.com, so go check it out. And as always, enjoy.